In the summer of 1980, a 19-year-old kindergarten assistant was invited to a house party in Sussex, and within 8 months, she was standing in St. Paul's Cathedral in a dress with a 25-foot train, while 750 million people watched on television. The speed of it is the first thing that requires examination. Not the romance, not the dress. The speed. 8 months from a house party in Sussex to the most watched wedding in human history is not the timeline of a love story. It is the timeline of a procurement. And the specific criteria that drove the procurement, the institutional requirements that Lady Diana Spencer met with a completeness that no other available candidate could match, are documented in the correspondence and the testimony of the people who ran the selection with a thoroughness that the romance narrative has spent 40 years obscuring. She was not chosen because Charles loved her. Charles had been in love with someone else for a decade by the time Diana appeared in his life, and the woman he loved was unavailable for the role the institution needed filled, and the institution had decided, with the pragmatic efficiency that it deploys when it has identified a problem requiring a solution, that the solution was not to wait for Charles to stop loving Camilla Parker Bowles, but to find someone who met the institutional requirements and place her in the position that Camilla could not occupy. She was not chosen because she was exceptional. She was chosen because she was suitable. The distinction matters enormously and has been almost entirely lost in the 40 years of biography and journalism and television drama that have accumulated around the story of her life. Suitable meant young. Suitable meant aristocratic. Suitable meant untouched by the kind of romantic history that the press could weaponize. Suitable meant malleable enough to be shaped by the institution into whatever the institution needed her to be. Suitable meant, in the specific formulation that Lord Mountbatten had used in the letters to Charles that Jonathan Dimbleby quoted in his authorized biography, possessed of no past. She had no past. She was 19 years old and she had no past, and she had a family name that went back further than the Windsors, and she was pretty enough for the photographs and young enough to be shaped and naive enough, by her own later admission, to have no idea what she was walking into. She walked in anyway. The institution discarded her 17 years later in a tunnel in Paris, and the discarding was not accidental, and it was not the consequence of her own behavior, and it was not the tragedy that the candlelight vigils and the flowers outside the palace and Elton John's rewritten song suggested it was. It was the predictable conclusion of a transaction that had been designed, from the beginning, to use her for what the institution needed and to manage the consequences of that use when the use was complete. Join me to find out. The search for a wife for Charles, Prince of Wales, had been a sustained institutional preoccupation since the early 1970s, and the preoccupation had produced, by the late 1970s, a set of requirements so specific and so clearly articulated in the private correspondence of the people managing it that the word search is almost misleading. It was not a search. It was a specification. And the specification had been written primarily by one man. Lord Louis Mountbatten, Philip's uncle, Charles's great-uncle, and self-appointed mentor, had been advising Charles on the question of marriage since Charles was a teenager, and the advice was documented in correspondence that Dimbleby had access to and quoted in the 1994 biography that the palace found so damaging and that Charles had authorized specifically because he wanted the record to show what his formation had actually looked like. The Mountbatten specification was explicit. Charles should spend his 20s accumulating romantic experience with as many women as possible. He should enjoy himself. He should have, in Mountbatten's phrase, his wild oats sown widely. And then, when the time came to marry, the rules reversed completely. The bride had to be young, ideally under 25. She had to be aristocratic, from a family whose background could survive the press scrutiny that a royal engagement generated. She had to be, in the phrase that Mountbatten used and that Dimbleby quoted, a girl with no past, no previous serious relationships, no romantic history that could be documented and published. The specification existed for institutional reasons that had nothing to do with Charles's happiness and everything to do with the monarchy's public image. A future Queen of England whose romantic history could be investigated and printed was a liability. A future Queen of England whose romantic history was non-existent was an asset. The asset requirement drove the age requirement, because the younger the bride, the less history she had accumulated, and the aristocratic requirement drove the family background requirement, because aristocratic families understood discretion in a way that other families did not and could be trusted to manage their daughters' histories accordingly. Mountbatten did not live to see the specification implemented. The IRA bomb that killed him in August 1979 removed him from the process at the point when the search was becoming urgent. But the specification survived him because the people who had heard it and absorbed it were still in place. And the most important of those people was Charles himself. Charles had absorbed the specification. He had also, across the years of his 20s, fallen in love with Camilla Shand, who would later become Camilla Parker Bowles. And Camilla Shand did not meet the specification, because Camilla Shand had a past and was older than the specification required and had, by the time Charles's marriage became an institutional imperative, married someone else. Charles and Camilla had maintained their connection across her marriage and across his various other relationships, and by the late 1970s, the nature of that connection was known within a sufficiently wide circle of the British establishment that the palace had concluded it was not manageable through the mechanism of selecting Camilla as Charles's wife, even if the other disqualifications had not applied. The palace's position on Camilla Parker Bowles in the period between 1978 and 1980, when the urgency of finding Charles a wife became acute, was the position of an institution that had identified a problem and was managing it rather than solving it. The management was the selection of a bride who was not Camilla. The problem was that Charles was in love with Camilla, and the selection of a bride who was not Camilla did not address that fact. The institution had decided that the fact did not need to be addressed. It needed to be bypassed. And the bypassing was accomplished by placing in Charles's path a young woman who met the specification so completely that the practical arguments for proceeding with the marriage overwhelmed the personal arguments against it. Diana Frances Spencer was born on the 1st of July, 1961, the third child of John Spencer, Viscount Althorpe, and Frances Roche at Park House on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, which meant she had grown up literally on the grounds of the royal family's country residence and had known the royal family in the casual way of aristocratic proximity since childhood. The Spencers were old money in the sense that the phrase means something specific in the English class system, which is that the Spencers had been part of the English aristocratic establishment for long enough that their position required no explanation and their connections required no cultivation. John Spencer's family had served the royal family for generations. Frances Roche's family connected through lines of aristocratic ancestry that predated the House of Windsor's own claim to the English throne. Diana's family background was, in the institutional assessment of the palace, impeccable. Her childhood was not impeccable. Her parents' marriage had collapsed when she was 6 years old, in a divorce whose custody battle had been bitter enough to reach the courts and public enough to generate press coverage. And the specific consequences of that collapse, the sense of abandonment, the difficulty with trust, the pattern of seeking approval from authority figures that her later therapists and biographers identified as the lasting formation of those early years, were consequences that the palace's assessment of her suitability did not include in its calculations, because the palace's assessment of her suitability was not a psychological assessment, it was a social one. She was socially suitable. She was psychologically unprepared for everything the social suitability was about to require of her, and nobody in the process of selecting her was looking at the psychological question with the seriousness it deserved, because looking at it seriously would have required acknowledging that the specification the institution had developed was a specification for a person who would be damaged by the role rather than equipped for it. The ideal royal bride was young enough to have no history. Young enough to have no history meant young enough to have no developed sense of self. No developed sense of self meant a person who would struggle to maintain psychological coherence under the specific pressures of the role, which were the pressures of total public visibility, combined with total institutional control, combined with the absence of the private support structures that most people rely on when those pressures become intense. The specification had selected for vulnerability while presenting the selection as a search for suitability. The palace had mistaken the absence of history for the presence of resilience. And the mistake was not correctable once the process was in motion, because the process moved too fast and the institutional momentum behind it was too great for any individual assessment of the specific person caught inside it to arrest. The courtship lasted from the summer of 1980 to the announcement of the engagement in February 1981, and the accounts of what those months were like for Diana, assembled from her own testimony in the Morton interviews, from the accounts of her friends during the period, and from the biographies of both principals, describe an experience that the word courtship does not accurately capture. She was watched. From the moment the press identified her as a serious candidate for the role of Charles's wife, which happened faster than anyone at the palace had anticipated, because the press had been watching Charles's social life with the sustained attention that comes from years of trying to identify the woman who would eventually be Queen. Diana was under a surveillance so total and so unrelenting that the specific quality of it was, by her own account, unlike anything she had experienced or could have prepared for. Photographers camped outside her flat in Earl's Court. They followed her to the kindergarten where she worked. They photographed her through shop windows and from cars parked across the street and from positions they had established in adjacent buildings. The photographs were published daily in the tabloids, and the tabloids' coverage of Diana in those months was the coverage of a story that had already been decided, a story in which she was the future queen, and the only remaining question was when the palace would confirm what the press had already concluded. She handled it. She handled it with a grace and a composure that impressed the people observing her, and that the palace noted as evidence that she was suited to the role. What the palace did not note, because noting it would have required thinking about her experience rather than her performance, was what the handling cost her. She was 19 years old. She had been living in a shared flat in Earl's Court. She had been working as a kindergarten assistant, and she was now the subject of a media operation of a scale and an intensity that would have been disorienting for someone twice her age with twice her experience of the world. She did not complain. She did not withdraw. She performed the role that was being asked of her before the role had been formally offered, and the performance was so complete and so consistent that the people watching it concluded that she was made for the position. She was not made for the position. She was performing for the position in the way that 19-year-olds perform when they understand that the audience is important and the stakes are high, and the failure to perform will cost them something they want. What she wanted was Charles, not the institution, not the title, not the role. Charles. And the performance she was giving was the performance she believed would secure the thing she wanted. Nobody told her that the thing she wanted came inseparable from everything she had not been told about. Nobody told her what the marriage would actually require. Nobody told her about Camilla. Nobody sat her down and explained with the honesty that the situation required and that her youth and her inexperience made essential, what the life of the Princess of Wales would look like from the inside. Nobody told her because the institution did not have a mechanism for telling her. The institution's mechanism was the selection and the engagement and the wedding and the management of public presentation at each stage. And the management of public presentation did not include the kind of honest premarital disclosure that the specific vulnerabilities of the specific person being selected made urgently necessary. The engagement was announced on the 24th of February, 1981. Charles and Diana were photographed in the grounds of Buckingham Palace. Diana wore a blue suit that she had bought off the rack because nobody had told her what to wear, and she had not known to ask. She wore the sapphire and diamond ring that she had chosen from a selection presented to her because it was the most beautiful one, and because she did not know, when she chose it, that selecting from a catalog was itself a departure from the personal gesture that the occasion might have been expected to involve. In the filmed interview that accompanied the engagement announcement, a journalist asked them whether they were in love. Diana said yes immediately. Charles said yes, whatever in love means. Whatever in love means. The phrase was noted at the time and dismissed as an eccentric qualification of an obvious statement by a man not given to obvious statements. In retrospect, it was the most honest thing said in any public communication about the marriage in the period between the announcement and the wedding, and it was honest in a way that its speaker may not have intended, and that its subject, standing beside him in the blue off-the-rack suit, did not fully understand. The wedding happened on the 29th of July, 1981, and was watched by 750 million people, and was described in the coverage of every major newspaper in the world as a fairy tale. And the description was wrong in the specific sense that fairy tales, whatever their relationship to reality, are stories in which the principal characters want the same thing at the same time. Charles and Diana did not want the same thing at the same time. Charles wanted a marriage that was socially functional and personally tolerable, that produced the heirs the institution required, and that did not prevent him from maintaining the connection with Camilla Parker Bowles that was the emotional center of his adult life. Diana wanted a marriage, a real one, the kind in which a husband is present and attentive and emotionally available and organizes his life around the partnership rather than around everything that preceded it. These two sets of requirements were not compatible, and their incompatibility was visible to Charles before the wedding, documented in the letters and the testimony that Dimbleby's biography assembled, and was not visible to Diana before the wedding because Diana did not know enough about the situation to understand what she was observing. She knew, in the days before the wedding, that something was wrong. She has described, in the Morton interviews and in the Panorama interview of 1995, the specific quality of her pre-wedding dread, the sense that she was walking into something she could not name and could not reverse, and that the people around her were not capable of helping her navigate. She was right. She was walking into something she could not name. The institution that surrounded her at that point had one gear, which was forward, and the momentum of the event, the dress and the cathedral, and the 750 million viewers and the 45 nations broadcasting the ceremony live, was a momentum that no individual anxiety could arrest. She married him. She walked up the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in the dress, with the 25-foot train and the veil embroidered with 10,000 mother-of-pearl sequins, and she repeated the vows, and she became the Princess of Wales at the age of 20 years old. And within weeks of the wedding, it was clear to everyone in her immediate circle that the marriage was in the condition that its foundations had always made inevitable. The years between 1981 and 1992 are the years that the biographies have documented most extensively, and that the institution has managed most carefully. And the management has consisted primarily of the sustained presentation of a public image of a functioning marriage that was not a functioning marriage in any private reality that the people inside it or close to it experienced. Diana's bulimia began in the early weeks of the marriage. She has described the onset in the Morton interviews, the specific precipitating incident, a comment Charles made about her weight shortly before the wedding that triggered in someone already vulnerable to the pressures of the role, a response that she would manage and mismanage and partially control and largely not control for the rest of her life. The bulimia was the most visible symptom of a psychological deterioration that the palace managed as a public relations problem rather than as a medical one. Because the palace's framework for managing its members' difficulties was the framework of image control rather than the framework of care. She was not given a therapist. She was given a press secretary. She was not given honest information about the structure of the marriage she had entered. She was given public engagements. She was not given the kind of sustained institutional support that someone of her age and her formation and her specific vulnerabilities required in the specific circumstances in which she found herself. She was given a lady-in-waiting and a protection officer, and a diary of public appearances, and the implicit understanding that the performance of the role was the institution's primary concern, and that everything else was her own responsibility to manage. She managed it, for periods, with a brilliance that the institution did not anticipate and could not control. The public Diana, the Diana who visited AIDS patients and sat on the edges of hospital beds and held the hands of dying people and looked at the cameras without the careful management that royal public appearances had always involved, was a Diana that the palace had not designed and could not have designed because the specific quality of her public presence was the quality of a person who was genuinely present to the people she was with rather than performing presence at them. It was the quality that the public responded to with a totality that alarmed the palace, because the response was to Diana specifically and not to the institution she represented. And an institution that depends on the public's emotional investment in the institution, rather than in its individual members, found the investment in Diana specifically destabilizing rather than useful. She was generating public capital at a rate and of a kind that the institution could not direct or deploy, and the institution's response to things it cannot direct or deploy is the response it has always deployed, which is management, containment, the slow reduction of the unmanageable element to a size that the institutional framework can accommodate. The containment of Diana across the 1980s has been documented in the accounts of her own household staff, in the testimony of people close to her during the period, and in the specific pattern of decisions that the palace made about her public role, her private access to support, and the management of the information about the marriage that reached the press. The containment was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense of a coordinated plot with a single directing intelligence. It was something more mundane and more institutional, the accumulated effect of dozens of individual decisions made by dozens of individual officials, each of whom was managing their specific piece of the problem rather than acknowledging the whole. The whole was a young woman of fragile psychological formation who had been placed in a role of extraordinary public demand without adequate preparation, who was receiving no adequate support, who was in a marriage that was not functioning, who was dealing with a husband who was emotionally unavailable because his emotional availability was committed elsewhere, and who was developing a series of responses to this accumulation of pressures that were visible to everyone around her, and that the institution was managing as image problems rather than as human ones. The separation came in December 1992, announced by John Major in the House of Commons, and the announcement was the institutional acknowledgement of what had been privately understood for years. The marriage was over in every practical sense. The question that remained, and that the palace spent the 5 years between the separation and the divorce, managing with the specific combination of deliberate delay and strategic reluctance that it brings to questions it would prefer not to address at all, was what to do with Diana after the marriage. The answer the institution arrived at, through the mechanism of the divorce that was finalized in August 1996, was to remove her from the family while retaining control of what she could and could not do with her remaining public life. The divorce settlement stripped her of the style of Her Royal Highness, which was the same instrument that had been used against Wallis Simpson 60 years earlier, and which served the same institutional purpose of reducing the person being managed to a social category that the family was not required to treat as fully equivalent to its own members. She retained the title Princess of Wales, she retained her apartments at Kensington Palace. She retained a significant financial settlement and the continued involvement in the public charitable work that had become the most visible expression of what she was to the public that loved her. What she did not retain was the institutional support that made the public role navigable. The protection, the staff, the access to the mechanisms that the palace provided for its members was reduced to the level of what the institution calculated she was entitled to as the divorced mother of the future king, rather than as the person who occupied in the public imagination of Britain and of most of the world a position of emotional significance that no institutional reclassification could change. She was, in August 1996, simultaneously the most famous woman in the world and a divorced woman living in an apartment in Kensington Palace without the institutional infrastructure that her public position required, and without the personal support that her divorced psychological situation demanded. The institution had taken what it needed from her, which was the two sons who were now the heir and the spare, and had returned to her a life that was nominally free and practically impossible. She died in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris on the 31st of August 1997, at the age of 36, in a car crash caused by a driver who was drunk and being pursued by photographers whose employment was the documentation of her existence for the consumption of a public that had been trained, by 15 years of press coverage, to regard access to her image as an entitlement. The photographers were the visible mechanism of her death. The structural mechanism was the 15 years of institutional management that had made her the kind of target that photographers pursued into tunnels. The institution that had selected her, used her, failed to support her through the use, and then removed the support structures it had provided when the use was complete, had also created the conditions of her public visibility that made the tunnel and the photographers and the drunk driver the specific combination that killed her. The palace's response to her death in the first days after the accident has been documented in exhaustive detail and has become, in the public understanding, the defining example of the institution's incapacity to respond to human reality with human instincts rather than institutional ones. The flag above Buckingham Palace did not fly at half-mast. The royal family remained at Balmoral. No statement was issued that acknowledged the specific quality of the public's grief, or engaged with its scale, or addressed the question of what the death of a 36-year-old woman, the mother of two children, the person whom more of the world's population had invested emotional significance in than any other individual of her generation, actually meant. The public was not looking for constitutional correctness. The public was looking for acknowledgement. The palace provided correctness. And the gap between what the public needed and what the institution provided in those first days was so total and so visible that it produced, in the streets outside Buckingham Palace and in the public commentary of the week following the crash, the closest thing to a genuine constitutional crisis that the British monarchy had experienced since the abdication of 1936. The institution eventually responded. The Queen returned to London, the flag flew, the address to the nation was delivered. The specific quality of the address, the language in which it was framed, and the emotional register it occupied was the language of an institution that had identified the gap between itself and the public and had decided to close the gap through the mechanism of statement rather than the mechanism of understanding. The statement worked. The crisis passed. The funeral on the 6th of September, 1997, produced an outpouring of public grief of a scale and an intensity that London had not experienced in any living memory, and the institution managed the funeral with sufficient responsiveness to the public mood that the constitutional danger of the preceding week was not realized. The management of the funeral was the final act of the institution's management of Diana. It managed her death as it had managed her life, as a public event requiring institutional response rather than as a human reality requiring human acknowledgement. The story of Diana Spencer and the British monarchy is not a love story, and it is not a tragedy, in the sense that tragedies require the downfall of someone who has made a fatal error. Diana made no fatal error. She was 19 years old, and she wanted to be loved by a man who was unavailable to love her, and she walked into an institution that selected her for what she could give it, and discarded her when the giving became inconvenient. The fatal error, if the word error can be applied to an institutional pattern rather than an individual choice, was the specification. The requirement for a bride with no past was a requirement for a person without the formed identity that the role demanded. The requirement for youth was a requirement for inexperience. The requirement for malleability was a requirement for the specific kind of psychological fragility that the institution's pressures would then systematically exploit. The institution got exactly what it had specified: a young woman with no past, from the right family, who could be shaped into the role the institution needed. And when the shaping produced, as it inevitably produced, a person whose response to the pressures of the role was not the composed compliance that the institution required, but a complicated and increasingly public assertion of her own reality, the institution responded with the only instruments it had, which were the instruments of management and containment and eventual removal. She was chosen in 1980 because she met a specification. She was used from 1981 to 1996 to produce two heirs and a public image of domestic monarchy that the institution needed. She was discarded in 1996 when the production had been completed, and the costs of maintaining the association had exceeded the institutional benefits of continuing it. She died in 1997 in conditions that the 15 years of her public use had directly created. And the institution managed her death the way it had managed her life, as a problem requiring a solution rather than a person requiring acknowledgement. The flowers outside the palace decomposed. The institution continued. It always does. That is what institutions are for. And the specific human cost of what this particular institution is for, calculated across the life of one woman from a house party in Sussex to a tunnel in Paris, is the accounting that the palace has spent the 27 years since her death declining to produce. The accounting is in the record. It has always been in the record.